will show up when you actually do the search. Now, when you do a search, and this is an example of a search for polyethylene glycol 6000, this is pretty much what's going to show up. And you'll see many different listings, and the names that are used are the substance registration names, or the preferred terms that come from the substance registration system that the FDA has, which is a separate database. They're now actually calling it the global SRS system, so you might see it listed as GSRS at times as well. So again, it's important to use the names that are consistent with the substance registration system if you want to see the results that are in the database. Now, some of the older listings might have old nomenclature, and that's an area where FDA is trying to clean this up. But when you look at this, it'll show you the route, the dosage form, the CAS number, the Unicodes for specific grades of the excipients, and then what the maximum potency is. And that actually is the highest level per unit dose. And it's important to stress that's per unit dose. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Priscilla to discuss Uni Numbers.
Thanks, Dave. So in the last slide, we saw Uni Numbers listed. So what do these Uni Numbers mean? According to FDA, these are assigned to specific grades of excipients, which describes their chemistry, but they're randomly assigned materials in the Global Substance Registration, or GSRS. The FDA, however, has not assigned a Uni number for every excipient in the IID. Things like mixtures and co-processed excipients do not have unique Uni numbers. CAS numbers are also listed in the IID, and can these identify an IID reference? Well, each listing in the IID does have a CAS number, but that CAS number may be the same as listed for many different grades of an excipient. So FDA actually prefers that the Uni number be used when referencing an excipient in the IID. Can compendial names be used for an IID search? As we mentioned before, the Global Substance Registration System uses what's called the preferred name, not the compendial name. And this may be the same name sometimes as the compendial name, but it's not the case for all listings. A lot of times, the other names might be listed as synonyms in the GSRS database. When it comes to labeling the excipient, however, the compendial name does need to be used on the label. So using the example of polyethylene glycol in the IID search, we see that the GSRS preferred name, polyethylene glycol 6000, is listed, and you'll also see that the Uni number is the same for all of these, even though there are some different dosage forms and routes of administration. Maximum potency is something that is also a very confusing term to a lot of users. This is the highest amount per unit dose. The FDA is working actually to standardize the units. In this table, we see the various dosage forms and the units listed. If you have looked at the IID in the past, you may have seen just a percent or milligrams, and it wasn't very well defined what the unit was. But the FDA has now been working on standardizing the units that are listing in the IID. So Dave, let's talk a little bit about using the IID information in an ANDA.
So thanks, Priscilla. Let's talk a little bit about how to use the IID in evaluating the safety of an excipient in an actual dosage form. And here in this FDA slide, we have an example of a drug product, which shows the amount of both the drug substance and the polyethylene glycol that is in the drug product. And you'll see there's 400 milligrams of the polyethylene glycol 6000 in this drug product, and that the drug product is dosed at 2 tablets a day. So the key question is the amount of the excipient per unit dose within the IID? And if you go back to what we had in the previous slide, answer is yes, because the level in the IID is 462.5 milligrams. So yes, we are within the IID, but the real question that FDA wants to answer is it within the maximum daily dose of what has previously been approved? And unfortunately, that information does not exist in the IID today, nor is it available in any type of FDA database at this time. So is the maximum daily dose higher than previously used products is the key question. And here we see that the maximum daily dose is 2 tablets, which is equivalent to 800 milligrams of the polyethylene glycol 6000, and that equals the actual maximum daily intake in the drug product. So as I mentioned, the IID doesn't really provide that maximum daily intake information of precedence of use of previously approved drugs. So there's uncertainty of whether FDA would find this acceptable because the 800 exceeds the level that's in the IID for one dosage form. So the provability of whether or not FDA will accept this is really determined in the scientific review itself. So during the filing of the drug, all they really are checking is whether or not you meet the IID level for a unit dose. But during the scientific review, they're going to be looking at the maximum daily intake, and that will also trigger whether the product can be approved eventually. So what are some of the options to support your drug application, since you really don't have the ability to know what the MDI is for the previously approved product? First, you can do a controlled correspondence, and this is pretty much what FDA has recommended for most people in the industry who are trying to find out this information, that they should submit a controlled correspondence with your specific level of use and request whether or not a drug has been approved with something higher than that in the past. Next, you could also provide safety data, which would include pharmacology and toxicology data to support the safety of the level of the use that you have, and try to make a safety argument based on that type of safety data. And finally, you can also reference an approved product that you might know about that has a higher level of use. Not everything is listed in the IID historically, and you may have a drug product where you know this particular excipient was used at a higher level. And if you want to reference that, you can do that as well. So let's talk a little bit about, how can controlled correspondence be used to relate to this maximum daily intake. As I mentioned, ANDA sponsors can request information from FDA about whether or not there is a prior precedence of use for your specific route of administration. And the ANDA sponsor has to provide the specific daily intake for an excipient, which is used in your specific drug application, and then ask the FDA if they confirm if this daily intake is lower than the MDI from the previously approved drug. It's important that you don't go in with an open-ended question. You can't just go in there and say, well, we want to know what the MDI is for this excipient, because FDA is not able to answer that question and will not answer that type of a controlled correspondence. You have to go in and say, this is what our level of use is proposed to be, and is there a level which is higher than that for this specific route? So FDA recommends that ANDA sponsors use this mechanism whenever you're uncertain of the daily intake that you have and whether it's below a previously approved MDI. Okay, so let's discuss the fact that many of the listings in the IID are not grade specific. Some of them may be listed as not specified or unspecified, or not have any type of a grade associated with it. We know that the FDA is having an increasing concern about various grades of excipients and the potential impact that different grades might have on performance. And so they don't always know what the grade was that was in the previously approved product that may have triggered the general listings in the IID that are listed as not specified or with no grade listing at all. And what they've pretty much made certain to the industry lately is that they really will no longer allow sponsors to reference these general listings in their ANDAs as the primary support of safety for the excipients without having some sort of a safety bridge that discusses more about why you feel that your particular application is justified from a safety perspective. So when the specific excipient grade is not available in the IID, these types of bridging justifications or specific safety data is required to support the excipient safety.
Okay, let's switch gears now and look at the current status of the IID. What is FDA actually doing to clean up the data in the IID? We know that there's a lot of inaccurate data in there, and a lot of it is incomplete. So FDA went through a period when no new listings were added to the IID because they had some resource issues. And they have been actually cleaning up the data in the IID for about the past 3 or 4 years. The IID maximum potency levels have actually changed a lot since August 2015 for some of the excipients listed in the IID. Some have increased and some have decreased, but some have also disappeared. So what has actually been changing in the IID? And this has actually been part of FDA's GDUFA goals, is to do the cleanup of the IID. We've seen changes in the IID listings themselves in terms of data integrity. They are actually reviewing past submissions to confirm the data that's in the IID. They're also looking at the nomenclature. They've removed things like trade names, and as we've mentioned previously, they are using the GSRS preferred name. And we're also seeing these differences in maximum potency. The FDA has been updating the IID now for the last couple of years and is publishing the corrections every quarter. Because of the updates to the IID, a lot of questions arise from the changes. So if the maximum potency has changed, but the drug was developed using a previous IID listing, what do you do? FDA expects the ANDA sponsor to use the current IID reference at the time of the filing. But if the excipient level now exceeds the maximum potency that was listed in the IID at the time of the filing, the sponsor is now expected to include an explanation stating that the previous IID maximum potency was used during drug development, but now they also have to provide either a bridging justification or safety data to support the level of use in the ANDA, since the previous listing in the IID was incorrect. So now we're going to take a look at the safety assessments that are needed for the bridging justifications. Dave, why don't you get us started on that?
Thanks, Priscilla. Okay, one of the questions that comes up a lot is, can toxicology summaries from suppliers be used to avoid getting refused to receive letters? And certainly toxicology summaries from suppliers are an important place where good information can come from. But you can also use references to tox data that is in their drug master file or possibly in the literature. And all of this can be used to build your bridging justification. However, it's very important that these types of summaries that typically you might get from your suppliers or from the literature, that those summaries are not relied on completely by themselves. Because if you just include a summary with no explanatory information about why that information matters to your specific case, that's not usually going to be found to be acceptable from the FDA. So you can't just include the summaries and say safety is taken care of. You need to build your story around why that information applies in your particular context of use. So the sponsor, the NDA sponsor, really needs to build this scientific explanation that supports the safety of the excipient in your context of use, which means the route of administration, the patient population, or the duration. So I mentioned that sometimes this information may be confidential and may be incorporated into an excipient drug master file. So how can that information be used as an ANDA sponsor when you actually don't have access to that information? It's confidential, but it can be seen by the FDA. So this information typically will only cover the supplier's intended uses of the product. So you need to understand, what have they included in their drug master file. If they say that their safety data is in the DMF, it's important that you have a discussion with that supplier so that you understand what kind of information is in the DMF and what types of applications, especially as it relates to the route of administration, et cetera, that the sponsor has included. Because sometimes the way you want to use it in your ANDA may be for a completely different type of drug product or a different functionality than what the supplier had intended when they did their initial supporting safety information. And then how can you justify a different route of administration if, in fact, you're using it in something different? So there may be, say, a lot of information on oral applications out there, and you want to use it in a buccal application, which is similar but not quite the same. So the bottom line is you're really going to have to, again, build this scientific bridging justification for a similar route to what it is you want to use, where you feel that you can scientifically justify that the data that exists for that other route can be utilized appropriately to justify the absorption and some of the other things that might go on in your specific context of use. So, references to other similar human exposure experiences should also be included in this type of an argument. But it's important that you just, again, don't reference the IID, that you build this story and build this argument about why the data that exists applies for your specific use. And, sometimes you want to use a higher level of use than what is in the IID. And many times to take advantage of the functionality of the excipients and to get it to work well in your particular dosage form, you may need to use it at higher levels. And certainly from a quality by design perspective, you don't want to not use anything just because it's not, it's maybe above the IID level if in fact you need that for your functionality. So how can you justify those higher levels of use when it makes sense? Again, it comes back to building that scientific bridging justification that can be developed and talked about as far as how different grades that might have higher levels already in the IID could be bridged over to your particular use and justify the level that you have. If you want to bridge from one grade to another, you need to discuss, however, the chemistry similarities between those different grades and the expected absorption similarities that might exist, and then reference any supporting information that goes into making that type of a chemistry argument if you're going to try to bridge to a different grade. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Priscilla to talk about some specifics as it relates to this topic.
So we were talking about how can you use information on the toxicology of the product to justify the level of use. And we're going to use HPMC, methicel HPMC, as an example. The chart that you see in front of you, the large box with the entire chart, represents basically the compendium monograph for HPMC. And of the 4 different types of chemistries for methicel HPMC, we have the boxes that are in color. So what we can do is that provided the grades that you're using are within the same family of HPMC, the highest maximum potency for a similar route of administration should be able to be used. The supplier should be able to provide then the information for the excipient family, demonstrating that all of these grades have the same tox profile to support a higher level of use. But we often find that the FDA is asking about specific toxicology for specific grades of excipients. Do suppliers have that type of information? Actually, we don't. The toxicology studies are related to the chemistry of the excipient. Tox studies are not done by the suppliers based on their intended use in specific routes of administration or dosage forms. As a supplier, we conduct toxicology testing on representative samples within the product family that bracket the range of grades. So one issue facing industry currently is that the FDA practice of requiring tox data for every grade of an excipient is not substantiated by the scientific rationale and is not aligned actually with FDA's risk-based approach, and it actually does create redundant work. Additional tox studies are not going to be done by suppliers because the tox studies that exist represent the toxicology for that product family. So if there's no tox data for a specific grade, what can you do? As we mentioned, the excipient grades within a family often have the same tox profile, so we don't have to do studies on specific grades. But as the user of the material, what needs to happen is a bridging justification needs to be developed to provide a summary of the relevant tox information and explain why the specific grade is covered by that data. And often the supplier can help you with that part of the information. Also, relative to oral dosage forms, we can also look at information that comes out of the generally recognized as safe or GRAS process that FDA CIFSAN has. This can sometimes be used to support higher levels of use for oral applications because a lot of these materials that are GRAS are also substances that are added to food, and food obviously is a type of oral administration. The determinations for GRAS include safety and toxicology information to support the safe level of use in a finished food. And foods often contain much higher levels of the substance than the level of an excipient used in a drug. So the GRAS status and the maximum daily intake for that food additive or GRAS material can be used to support higher than IID levels for an excipient that has the same chemistry as the GRAS substance. So what does FDA expect in these bridging justifications? The bridging justification is not just about the data. You actually have to tell FDA your story. And we even hear this over and over from speakers at conferences from FDA. So FDA considers the following things important elements of a bridging justification. You have to demonstrate the similarity as well as the differences between the excipients, the existing non-clinical and clinical data if it's available. You have to be able to address any data gaps and also address the proposed context of use. So how much information does FDA expect or need in a bridging justification? Well, that really depends on the existing knowledge for the excipient and the specific context of use for that sponsor's drug. The information can be extrapolated for safety in specific cases where the data also doesn't exist. The difference in performance and substitutability between grades and suppliers often does not impact the safety profile of the excipient. So safety is not always equal to performance. So where will this context of use data come from? Actually, it has to come from the drug product manufacturer. The excipient industry and your supplier cannot provide this context of use. They can only provide the tox information for the excipient itself. So when the sponsor submits the information to support the intended use, what they're looking for is general toxicology and safety data, or you can do references to publicly available literature for the excipient independent of its context of use. Then you have to put together a safety package or a rationale to support that use in your specific drug product, which has to take into account justification for route of administration, duration of use, level of use, patient population, and then the other important factors. Non-clinical data may also be available and be able to be interpreted to justify the context of use for the excipient. So the idea is you have to build this justification into your bridging justification. You can't just take data and give it to FDA and expect them to put that information together. So when we're talking about the road to approval for your ANDA, the amount of safety data that's needed in the bridging justification for the excipient really depends on sufficient information to support the overall safety of the excipient for its route of administration and use level, but also, very importantly, the context of use and how that excipient will be used in a specific formulation related to a specific patient population. So at this point, we're going to talk about a couple of case studies that FDA has presented, and hopefully this will give you some idea of what FDA considers good information and what can be improved. Dave?
Thanks, Priscilla. So these case studies are actually derived from a presentation that an FDA toxicologist named Bob Dorsum presented at a USP meeting last year. And the reference for these slides is actually listed in one of the last slides of the presentation series here today. So you'll be able to go look at this information if you want. So the first case study that we're going to talk about, and these are real-life case studies that were handled by the FDA in the past that they told industry about. And so this particular case study was an oral suspension for intermittent chronic use, and the ages that were expected to be covered by this drug were from 2 years old to adult. So when this application came in, the Division of Clinical Review was consulted on the safety of a proposed maximum daily intake of 900 milligrams of the excipient per day. So this is what the drug manufacturer was proposing in their drug, 900 milligrams per day. Now, the justification that the applicant included in their application or their ANDA was information related to the JECFA review of this excipient. They included a non-clinical tox summary data from various excipients in the class ranging in various different molecular weights. And then they talked about farm tox information that already existed, which supported the fact that 53 milligrams of the excipient had already been approved in oral drugs for adults for chronic use. They discussed the fact that the polymer was negative for genotoxicity and had low absorption for the high molecular weight polymers. They identified the NOELs in rodent studies for various grades of this excipient as well. Now, after FDA did the review, they identified various gaps in the justification that had been built by this particular drug sponsor. And they said, well, the molecular weight of the grade that you're actually using is much lower than the grades that were evaluated in the published literature, and the absorption of the low molecular weight grade was not characterized in any of the information that the sponsor submitted. They also discussed the fact that the sponsor was proposing a level of use of this excipient which was 18 times higher than the level that had been previously approved for this route of administration, and the sponsor had not provided any justification for pediatric safety in their application at all. So FDA's assessment after that review was that this ANDA was seen to be deficient, and there was clinical informed tox information needed on long-term safe use of this grade. So the analysis of the situation, according to FDA, was that the sponsor did not address the absorption profile of the low molecular weight grades. They felt that if the sponsor had actually provided a scientific justification to show that the absorption profiles, were not impacted by the change in the molecular weight, that in those cases probably additional tox studies would not be needed, or tox data. They felt that the basic literature that was provided in the ANDA did really not address pediatric use, and there wasn't really any argument to say why this was acceptable for pediatrics. And especially since they were proposing to use a level that was 18 times higher than the level that had been previously approved for adults, they felt that the sponsor would need to explain and justify why this level would be acceptable for both children and adults. The JECFA data that was presented was for foods, and that could be used in the justification if it was at a similar level of use. And they could use an argument such as the fact that children eat this excipient as a food additive, and therefore it should be acceptable for pediatric use. But essentially the sponsor never built this into their case. So they didn't tell the story, as Priscilla said, about why this information actually applied in their particular context. Now, to get into another case study related to route of administration, I'm going to pass it on to Priscilla.
Thanks, Dave. So in the last example, we saw where FDA had identified some gaps that led to a deficiency. And it really centered on the fact that the sponsor did not give enough information to tell the story. In this case study, looking at a bridge for the route of administration, the proposed product was a film that would be delivered by a buccal route of administration for adults. The safety assessment for local and potential systemic toxicity would be a factor, and there were 9 excipients used in this drug. 3 were polymers. There was also flavor and some preservatives. But the applicant gave some very comprehensive information. They provided controlled correspondence and a very comprehensive literature review on the excipients that are used in the formulation. They also provided a good justification for the polymers that included not only a physical description of the excipient, but also published safety information. When the FDA reviewed the information, they looked at things like the tox report, the controlled correspondence, safety findings from a bioequivalent study. They looked at their own database information, as well as toxicology and other medical literature, which were all provided by the sponsor. And each excipient was reviewed for its presence in approved drug products of similar context of use that included systemic exposure and local safety in clinical and non-clinical information. There were some easily correctable deficiencies that FDA sent to the sponsor to clarify the composition of the flavor and also to address its local and systemic safety, but these were all taken care of relatively easily. So in the end, FDA's assessment included the fact that several of the excipients had been used in similar approved drug products. The flavor was reviewed using the component approach, and the polymer bridging information considered the molecular characteristics, prior use in FDA-approved products, available farm tox and clinical safety information with this material and similar grades, the low probability of absorption, and relevant oral safety information. So they concluded that all of the excipients in this film were acceptable based on the evidence of local and systemic safety. So this is a really excellent example of a case study where the sponsor built a very comprehensive bridging justification for oral to buccal route of administration. The flavor information was a bit weak, but they answered the questions that FDA added to them, and then they were able to get the drug approved. So to get towards the end of our presentation now, what can we as the global regulatory expertise that we have for our alliance products support your filings that we can provide information from Dow and from ColorCon? Our alliance can provide a number of pieces of information. We do have toxicology studies that are either ones that we have developed or that are coming from publicly available literature. If we have a drug master file for the product, we can provide a letter of authorization. And as Dave mentioned before, you're welcome to talk to us about what kind of tox information or other relevant information may be in our drug master file. We also can provide information on the chemistry of why the toxicology data applies to multiple grades within the same excipient family. The example I used before was Methocel HPMC. We also have the product specifications that are related to the IID, and if additives are used, we can provide that information. We also can provide very personalized support based on information that you might be able to share if FDA has questions related to the excipient. We also have a lot of product literature, excipient information packages, and other information that we can share with you so that you can build the excipient part of your information to bring that into the context of use that you need to build for your bridging justification to tell your story to FDA. So I hope this has given you some insight into how the IID works, what some of the issues are that FDA is working on, and also how our Dow ColorCon Alliance can help you with your bridging justification. I'd like to acknowledge the support and the information that FDA has allowed us to share with you today. They've been very helpful in sharing this information and wanting to get the information out to the pharmaceutical community so that everybody understands what their expectations are. And with that, I'd like to pass the presentation back to our moderator, who will take some questions from the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Priscilla, and thank you, Dave, also. Just a quick reminder to the audience, you can submit your questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the presentation window. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So first up, Dave, this one's for you. What's the most frequent question about the IID that you get from customers?
Thanks, Rita. Well, this is a good one because I've been at ColorCon for 41 years, and there's probably one question I get asked more than any other question I've ever had from customers, and it happens all the time. And everybody asks me whether or not the information in the IID is related to a unit dosage form or to the MDI. And that question keeps coming up and up and up. And the bottom line is it absolutely is information related to the unit dose and the level that was in a unit dose that was approved. It is not the MDI or related to the MDI. However, some companies can use it in building their story by explaining how if they have an MDI that is lower than the level that's in the IID, well, obviously the IID level is the amount in one tablet, or one dosage form. So you have to have at least that much in a daily dose. So if your MDI is lower than that, you can use the IID level to support your MDI. However, if your MDI is higher than what's in the IID, then really, unless you have internal information related to previously approved drugs where you know the level that was previously used on a daily basis, then you're going to really have to do a controlled correspondence at this time to find out what the level is that's associated with the acceptability of the level you want to use. Now, in the future, FDA has committed in the GDUFA 2 commitment letter that they will incorporate the MDI information in the IID, I believe, by 2020. So in the future, there will be some useful information, but for now, it has to be done using a controlled correspondence.
Thank you, Dave. Priscilla, this one's for you. So how can I use the unspecified general listings for excipients in the IID to support my use of a specific grade in my ANDA?
Thanks, Rita. As Dave had mentioned earlier in the presentation, FDA doesn't really allow you to just mention the unspecified listings. You actually have to justify the use of a specific grade, especially if other grades in the IID do have specific listings. So what you're going to need to do is to get information from your supplier regarding the tox information that either exists in their DMF or maybe in published literature that can support the safe use of the grade that you actually want to use. You have to be able to explain why the chemistry of all grades are comparable to those of other grades so that you can apply that to the grade that you're using. In particular, you want to look at things like the absorption characteristics of the grades and also compare the information to whether you're doing the same type of route of administration as might be available in the tox literature for that grade. So you really can't use the unspecified listing by itself, but you can use the information for other grades to support the listing that you're trying to make that bridge to.
Thanks, Priscilla. Dave, here's one for you. How can I use UNII codes that are listed in USP monographs to support the use of an excipient in my ANDA?
Thanks, Rita. I'm really glad that question came in because this is a very sort of hot topic right now. And a number of people have been asking this type of a question throughout the industry because Unicodes have been showing up in USP monographs and not all the Unicodes associated with particular materials have been present. And this has created a lot of confusion. So if you go into the IID, you might see a whole bunch of Unicodes associated with a particular excipient family. And the USP monograph that has listed this might only have one, and it might only list, say, the unspecified number. So this has created much confusion. And so at the International Pharmaceutical and Excipients Council, IPEC, we've been working closely with the USP to essentially get these Unicodes removed from monographs because what is currently listed in many cases is incorrect or certainly not complete. And there's been a lot of work that IPEC has been doing with FDA over the past few years to clean up nomenclature in the IID and in the GSRS system that I mentioned earlier. There have been some data integrity problems at FDA in terms of the type of information that is in the IID and in the GSRS system, and we brought this to the attention of USP and why it really is not advisable for them to incorporate any type of Unicodes in monographs at this time without creating a lot of confusion. Fortunately, after much discussion that we've had, I'm very happy to say that on August 31st, the USP published a notice on their website. Again, you can find that notice, or we can provide that to you if you want. But that notice basically says that the USP will be removing all Unicodes from excipient monographs in the very near future to avoid this type of confusion. And then we will continue to have ongoing discussions between IPEC, USP, and FDA about how to use these Unicodes appropriately. Certainly, anything that's listed in a USP monograph at this time should never be used to try to justify your ANDA references for excipients because of the problems that are going on and the fact that these listings will be removed very soon.
Thank you, Dave. Priscilla, here's another one for you. So can Dow and ColorCon supply toxicology data for the specific grades of Alliance products that we're using in a particular drug application?
That's a good question, Rita. So as I had spoken about before, we really can't provide tox data on very specific grades for the Alliance products because we do these tox studies based on the chemistry of the polymer, and we're doing it based on the grades that bracket the whole family of grades. But we can provide that kind of information either through referencing our drug master file or publicly available literature and can help you build the information that explains why one particular grade fits into that overall tox profile. We also can provide information to our sponsors that are filing the ANDAs to build your story for your bridging justification. And as I was mentioning towards the end of the presentation, we not only have the tox summaries that are available and the letters of authorization that we can provide to drug master files, but we can help you build that bridging justification around the excipient so that you can put that into the context of use for your specific formulation, your route of administration, your dosage form, even your patient population in some cases. And we also have other product information that together between Dow and ColorCon, we can provide your specifications, product literature, excipient information, and we can also field some of the questions that you might get from the FDA or maybe help you build information into your controlled correspondence so that we can provide the information that you need for the excipient part of your ANDA and hopefully be able to put that whole story together for FDA so that they don't come back with a lot of questions.
Well, thank you, Priscilla, and thank you, Dave, for your presentations and for taking the audience questions. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and participating in this event. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, ColorCon and DuPont Nutrition and Health, for making today's webcast possible. You'll receive an email from Pharmaceutical Technology alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. I invite you to forward that announcement to any colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good day.